In 1992, four friends and former members of the Swedish Amiga demo group The Silence founded a company called Digital Illusions and released their very first game, Pinball Dreams, on the Amiga. Pinball Dreams was a technical gem, with silky smooth scrolling, beautiful graphics and amazing atmospheric mod music, and it set a new standard for a modern pinball game. And I desperately wanted to play it, so I went on the lookout for something similar on my beloved ST. Sadly, the only thing I could find was the game Pinball Magic by Logiciel, and that just didn't do it for me. And to my frustration, by the end of that same year, the sequel to Dreams was released, called Pinball Fantasies, raising the bar even higher. This time, each of the four tables occupied 3 screens. When it was finally available on the PC, I couldn't stop playing. What an addictive experience. But still, it wasn't on the ST, and that really hurt. Until 1994. That year, we got not one, but 2 amazing pinball games. When ST Format started to release the first preview pictures of a game called Obsession, I literally got obsessed. I drooled over the shots. And we all know the story by now. Unique Development Sweden finally released their pinball game at the end of 1994, and it was just as good as the Digital Illusions games. Graphically, sonically and gameplay wise. It was simply amazing. But there was one catch. Obsession was an STE only game, so a lot of ST players were left in the dark. And the second pinball release of that year has always remained a bit in the shadows of its bigger brother, and that is a real shame. ST Format even dubbed it Best PD Game of all time when they released it on the cover disc of their November 1994 issue. Yes, that's right, a PD game, and even more so, it ran on a vanilla ST with only half a meg of RAM, and to this day the title is considered an absolute landmark in Atari ST gaming history. Friends, this is one of those titles I wanted to cover for a very long time, so join me as we dive into the history of the pinball action game Starball. The year is 1990 when Dave and Andy meet for the first time. Dave was working on a shooter for the Atari ST and was showing a work in progress with rudimentary graphics. Andy was really impressed, and from that point on, the duo knew they wanted to create cool things together. But of course, this is not the very beginning of this story. For Dave, the ultimate starting point was somewhere around the age of 3 years old and basically wanting to be Doctor Who. As a kid, he was obsessed over how things worked, electronics and computers, and Doctor Who was the ultimate tech nerd. So for his 10th birthday, he received a ZX81. He never bought any software for the machine. He wrote everything himself, typing in dozens of programs. After the ZX, the Spectrum followed, where he was exposed to hundreds of games. One of those was Mike Singleton's epic fantasy game, The Lords of Midnight, which to this day is Dave's favorite game. By Christmas 1986, he got himself an Atari ST. The jump from a machine that you just couldn't work on to one that was just as good for writing software on as using software was amazing for Dave. In no time, he had written his first assembly code on the ST. A little later, he did his own full conversion of the game The Lords of Midnight for the Atari ST, just so he could play it. But it wasn't until the day he witnessed the game Nemesis at the arcades that Dave knew he wanted to make computer games. He walked out, went home and started to fiddle with some code on a mission to create his own Nemesis clone. This was around 1988. Andy always had a fascination for drawing and sketching, taking art classes and exams during his school years. He also found himself developing an interest and excitement around computers. His first computer, the Sinclair ZX81, was a wonderful introduction, despite being such a limited system. However, at that time the two interests did not really mesh together, as computer graphics capabilities on those early machines seemed very limiting, and so he actually spent a bit more time on the computer playing games and teaching himself some basic coding. One of his favorite games was the FPS classic 3D Monster Maze, which seemed like a window into a new world. With the arrival of the 16-bit computers, a lot of graphical limitations were removed. And by 1987, Andy bought an Atari ST just to explore the interesting bitmap graphics capabilities. The fact that it is also a cool gaming system was an added bonus. But back to 1990 now, more precisely the summer before university. Dave was working in a comic book store which had a Sega Mega Drive with the fantastic Thunder Force 3 game. This game had some amazing parallax scrolling effects. Dave was completely absorbed by it. He was reminded of his old Nemesis clone code he wrote 2 years ago. So he took that and he started working out some theories on doing parallax scrolling. Using a pre-shifted background, he was able to do something pretty reasonable. Arbitrary parallax fell out of that pretty much for free. So he was able to copy Thunder Force sign distorted backgrounds, which looked really impressive. Everything was running at 3 frames per update, which is about 16 frames per second. It was this demo that Dave showed to Andy. Andy then drew up a bunch of cool graphics and together they decided to create a trial level. But because this was all during the days Dave did not properly understood data structures and because he was still using a reasonably primitive assembler, it was very hard work and the code was also becoming fiendishly complicated. Mix in a healthy dose of university work and the project fell into disuse and never got restarted again. Such a shame. During the summer holidays of 1991, Dave was back at the shop. Around that time, Technosoft released the fabulous pinball Devil Crash. Dave was amazed that it did things you couldn't do in real pinball. It had wandering targets and bonus screens. And in addition, he also started to get into real pinball at the Students' Union. Early in 1992, while attending a very tedious solid states physics lecture, instead of trying to understand phonons, Dave was fiddling with the math of pinball collisions. He worked out a theory. If he decomposed ball velocity into tangential and normal components to the wall, he could simulate surface bounciness and roll, and also apply kickers. By the end of the lecture, he'd also worked out a cheap method to calculate the collision angle by which a ball hit a bitmap that marked the solid parts of the level. The next day, he started coding everything in 68K assembler, still using the old trusty K-Saga tool released in 1986. He reused the fast blitting and sprite routines he had developed for the shoot 'em up, and after a few days of hacking, the basics for a smooth scrolling pinball engine were the result. When he tested his rudimentary game, he was more than a little surprised it just worked, even when combined with very simple drawn images and gravity models. Dave managed to program a pinball engine in the first weeks of the Starball project, and these core routines were never touched again throughout the further creation of the game. And when Andy saw the first tests, he started working on the graphics. He was still very much learning how to do graphics that fit within the necessary restrictions imposed by the design of the software. The only experience he really had were the test graphics he created for the shoot 'em up a year earlier. But this project was of much larger scale. This time he had to make fitting graphics for the design of the table and develop sprites and animations. It was quite a different challenge. Andy was inspired by movies like Alien, but also from other game artwork, like that of the Bitmap brothers. Dave also wanted to give the game a bit more pop, a more console-like feel, and Starball had to feature more colors on screen than a regular SD game. To achieve this, color palette switching was used. The complete main table of the game was several screens high and was divided into 3 sections. Each section featured its own color palette. If you would not be using different color palettes, Starball would look a bit more bland. Let's say we only use the top color palette on the full table, or the second, or the third. But there was one problem. You see, the palette shifts were not matched up exactly with the boundaries of the images used to create the full table. Andy designed all graphics exclusively using Degas Elite, and this program had no built-in support for this kind of palette swapping in real time. So he had to flip palettes back and forth manually on a regular basis. This whole image is 800 pixels high, but in Degas you could only create images with a height of 200 pixels. This means more images had to be stitched together to create the full table image. And the problem was, these stitching points did not always match the shift. In the end, Andy could only check how the areas of the images worked together by integrating them into the game. The development of Starball spanned over 2.5 years, and new gameplay ideas came along as the project moved forward. Apart from having the main table with its 3 different pins, each having its own missions, enemies and strategies, there were also extra bonus tables created. These were a real treat. Small, one-screen pinball tables, heavily inspired by classic games. You had Invader Ball, based on classic Space Invaders, Llama Ball, which was an ode to the legendary Jeff Minter. There was also an Arkanoid-inspired table, and finally Egg Ball, which turned the game into a more contemporary little shoot 'em up. During the development, Dave got distracted by silly little ideas. One of them started out as cloning a Starfield routine from Tempest 2000, a game he played a lot on Andy's Jaguar, which ended up as the intro of Starball. Another one became the LED bonus board. It looked simple, but it was a devious bit of code. Starball used an awful lot of demo code class graphics routine tweaking and load balancing to get it to run at a fixed 25 frames per second on an ST and 50 frames per second on a Falcon. Getting it to play identically at both frame rates was done with a nice trick. On the ST, the ball physics ran twice per frame, and on the Falcon, the sprites and collisions only ran once every other frame. The fantastic quartet intro music was composed by none other than the legendary Dave Moss from the demo team The Lost Boys. By an astounding coincidence, Andy shared a couple of university courses with his brother Tim Moss. When he told him they were working on an ST game, he was generous enough to offer them one of his brother's music tracks along with the replay code, but it was not written specifically for Starball. By that time, the Lost Boys had more or less finished their involvement with ST demo development with the release of Oh Crikey, What a Scorcher. For Dave, the game suffered from one major design error. The flippers in Starball are set at a much shallower angle than is typical in computer pinball games. They are not steep enough, and because of this, he had struggled with gameplay balance all the way through the project. It was a complete nightmare. The flippers were part of the initial prototype and were never touched again. And by the time he realized what a problem it was too late, as it would take a complete table redesign to solve it. Anyway, I never really noticed while playing. What started as an idea for a pinball table based on a puppet series Starfleet ended up being a console quality Devil Crush inspired game for the Atari ST, featuring more than 24 screen colors, over 32 sprites on screen, stunning sound effects, silky smooth scrolling and so much more. And by mid-94, Starball was completed and ready for the public. And the fact that the duo made it this far, they considered their biggest achievement. Starball, developed by Volume 11, which was a reference to the gag in the movie Spinal Tap, and released as shareware, was uploaded to various ATP sites and a post on CompSys Atari ST on Usenet. This happened on the 13th of June 1994. Because Jeff Minter had quite a bit of success with Lamatron, and because Doom was making it big in the news, the duo thought they'd give the shareware model a try. If you downloaded Starball and enjoyed the game, Dave and Andy were asking for £5 in return. During the summer of 1994, they started working on an ICA Plus style beat 'em up for the Falcon, called Super Kick Up. Because of the lack of sales of Starball, Dave was extremely disappointed. It was obvious the ST was dead and gone, and the Falcon was not gonna cut it, so the project got canned. Andy got a job offer to work for Argonaut Software on 3D graphics technology. But Dave wanted to make a living in the games industry and turn Volume 11 into a real company, and Andy promised he would return if Dave managed to do this. Dave started converting Starball to the PC and eventually got a deal with GameTech to complete this version. When the graphics needed an update, Andy quit his position at Argonaut and started working for Dave again. A few months later, Dave got an email from ST Format. He answered a few questions and was slightly surprised when it turned up as an interview about shareware. Starball was reviewed in the October issue of 1994 and received a whopping 96% and an ST Format Gold Award. A month later, in issue 64, the game was featured on the magazine's cover disc. Because Starball was PD, they were totally entitled to do that. To Dave's frustration, all this coverage did not turn into more sales. In the end, they made about £1,000 on the ST version of Starball. Meanwhile, work on the DOS version continued. When it was released in 1996, Starball on the PC featured 256 colors on screen, multi-ball and much more. Dave even composed the music for the game. It also had an extra bonus table called the pool table, which let you play multi-ball pool with only one ball having gravity on it. GameTech asked them to pull that out of Starball and turn it into a whole new game, but they couldn't think of enough good ideas to make it work eventually, so that bit got lost in time. After Starball, work on a sequel started. Starball 2 was going to be a 7-table story-driven comedy space pinball, as Dave describes it, with 16-bit graphics. But after 8 months into development, the publisher folded. After this, Volume 11 changed direction and they became a company that provided engineering and optimization in the emerging PC 3D hardware acceleration market. And they became quite successful at it too. The Starball adventure is one of those tales of true dedication and belief, which ends in great disappointment because of financial failure. These days, however, Dave and Andy have a positive look on the whole thing. It was great practice and it landed them their current jobs. In the end, Starball was extremely well received and they are still terribly proud of their accomplishment. And rightfully so. And that's it for now. I hope you all enjoy the show and remember, stay Atari.
Extra ball.